Laughter echoed across the Arizona desert as Jules Becker lifted his rifle and took aim. It looked like a handcrafted antique. Polished wood, a simple mechanical scope, not a wire or sensor in sight. Around him, a cluster of young engineers and officers grinned and rolled their eyes. They were surrounded by cutting-edge sniper rigs and smart scopes, all humming with AI assistants and laser rangefinders. To them, this old man with a wooden rifle was a quaint sideshow. A few of them chuckled, and one called out mockingly, "Careful you don't get splinters from that museum piece." More laughter erupted, but Jules remained quiet. He had faced worse than ridicule in his 64 years. Jules exhaled slowly, drowning out the jeers. Through the simple crosshairs of his aging scope, he saw the distant target shimmering in the heat. No fancy digital overlays, no auto-calculations, just his own eyesight and experience. He felt the dry wind on his cheek, the subtle change in breeze that others' instruments hadn't registered yet. With practiced ease, he adjusted his aim a hair above and to the left, compensating by instinct. The crowd continued to snicker, oblivious to the decades of skill coiled in this quiet man. Jules gently squeezed the trigger. Bang! The wooden rifle kicked, and almost immediately Jules chambered another round and fired again, then a third time, each shot in steady rhythm. Clang, clang, clang. 3 hits rang out on the distant steel target in quick succession, silencing the spectators. The laughter died abruptly. Faces that were smug moments ago now stared through binoculars and digital scopes with wide eyes. A young technician's voice cracked through the hush. "Wait, that grouping is within sub-MOA. How?" He gaped at the data on his tablet, incredulous that the old rifle's shots landed almost on top of each other at such range. Lieutenant Kyle Rayner's confident smirk had vanished, his jaw now slack in disbelief. The desert air was suddenly still. No one was laughing now. In that stunned silence, one truth had become crystal clear. The antique in Jules' hands was no joke, and neither was the man holding it. For everyone who's ever been underestimated and longed to prove the doubters wrong, this was the moment. If you believe experience can triumph over arrogance, then stick around, because this story isn't over yet. Hours earlier, the Defense Tech Expo was in full swing under the desert sun. Booths boasted autonomous drones, smart targeting systems, and rifles that could almost fire themselves. Yet, off to one side, at a modest folding table, sat Jules Becker, a retired sniper who once served with distinction but now wore a simple faded jacket. In his hands was a wooden replica rifle he had crafted himself. Not many visitors stopped by his little demonstration area. It wasn't shiny or digital, just an old marksman teaching fundamentals. Still, Jules smiled warmly as a curious young cadet paused to listen. "It's all about breathing and patience," Jules said softly, guiding the teenager on how to hold the wooden rifle. The boy, barely 18, eyes wide with admiration, tried to mimic Jules's posture. "Breathe in, let half the breath out, that's it. Now gently squeeze, don't pull." The cadet steadied the mock rifle at a paper target only 50 yards out. Even in the chaos of the expo, the old sniper's calm instruction felt like a quiet bubble of focus. The lad fired the practice round with a pop, clipping near the bullseye on the paper. His face lit up. Jules gave a proud nod, wrinkles crinkling at the corners of his eyes. Moments like this made him feel all those years of service still mattered. Nearby, a group of sharply dressed officers and engineers strolled past carrying tablets and sporting the latest augmented reality visors. Leading them was Lieutenant Kyle Rayner, the 33-year-old wunderkind behind the Army's new drone-assisted sniper system. Rayner was riding high on confidence, After all, he was here to demonstrate a prototype scope that used AI and drones to adjust aim in real time. As he walked by Jules's humble booth, he couldn't resist a jibe. "Teaching kids with wooden toys, old-timer?" Rayner smirked, loud enough for others to hear. A couple of his colleagues chuckled. The cadet at Jules's side looked down, embarrassed for the kindly old sniper. Jules simply rested a hand on the wooden rifle's stock, the same way one might pat a loyal old dog. "Even the best technology can learn a thing or two from the basics, son," he replied evenly, looking Rayner in the eye. His voice was polite, but there was steel underneath. Rayner raised an eyebrow at the comeback. He noticed an engraving on the rifle's wooden body, faint, hand-carved letters and numbers. "Camp Pendleton, 1983. First shot drill." Rayner let out a short laugh, waving a dismissive hand. 1983? Is that supposed to impress me? This isn't a history museum, Gramps. He shook his head as his entourage snickered and moved on. Jules watched them go, saying nothing, but the cadet fumed on his behalf. Not long after, an announcement crackled over the expo's PA system. A live fire accuracy demonstration was about to begin at the range. This was Rayner's moment to shine for the crowd and the top brass evaluating his system. Spectators and officials gathered by the firing line where targets were set up at extreme distances across the desert plain. Rayner set up his ultra-modern rifle on its bipod, a small drone hovering beside him, feeding wind and distance data into his smart scope. He talked up its capabilities for all to hear, boasting that hitting a target at 1,200 yards was now practically point and click. Jules hung back behind the crowd, content to observe. But then, one of the senior officers, a grizzled colonel who had noticed Rayner's earlier jibe, cleared his throat. "We've heard the tech talk, Lieutenant. Now, how about a little friendly contest?" the colonel said, half smiling. He beckoned Jules forward out of the crowd. "I saw this gentleman earlier with that classic rifle. Let's see how old-school skill stacks up against your fancy computers." A hush fell. Rayner looked stunned for a moment, then forced a grin. He certainly hadn't planned on sharing the stage. "By all means," he said, trying to hide his annoyance, "though I'm not sure our friend's antique even fires live rounds." A few people in the crowd murmured laughter. Jules' eyes narrowed slightly. He hadn't come here for competitions or pride. He was here to inspire young shooters. But he also wasn't about to refuse a direct request from a colonel, nor the chance to quietly stand up for the old ways. With a polite nod, he stepped forward to the firing line, wooden rifle in hand. A range officer handed him a spot next to Rayner. The contrast was almost comic. Jules lying down with a rifle that looked straight out of a Vietnam-era display, and Lieutenant Rayner prone beside him amid a spread of high-tech gadgetry. The onlookers shifted excitedly, sensing a story in the making. One of Rayner's techs whispered, "This won't take long." Rayner just smirked, peering through his digital scope as data danced across his screen. Before the shooting started, Jules glanced to his right. The young cadet he'd helped earlier had squeezed through the crowd to watch from behind the fence, worry and hope in his eyes. Jules offered the kid a small, reassuring smile. This wasn't about humiliating anyone. It was about proving something quietly true. He settled into position, resting the wooden rifle on a simple sandbag. The old familiar weight of it grounded him. All around, the crowd waited with bated breath. It would be a duel between cutting-edge technology and decades-honed skill. Would an old wooden rifle really stand a chance against a state-of-the-art smart scope? The audience was about to find out. What do you think will prevail? Raw experience or advanced tech? And so, as the sun dipped lower and painted the sky orange, Jules Becker prepared to fire the first shot of a challenge no one saw coming. The true test was about to begin. A tense hush fell as Jules and Raynor settled into position, rifles pointed at identical targets glinting in the distance. A range officer ensured both men had the same high-grade ammo, laying 2 identical boxes by their elbows. The wind had picked up slightly, a fickle desert breeze that danced across the sand. Overhead, Raynor's small drone buzzed, relaying live readings to his visor. Jules, by contrast, closed his eyes for a moment, attuning himself to the environment the old-fashioned way. The crowd watched from behind, dozens of eyes darting between the cutting-edge scope and the relic of wood and steel. Lieutenant Raynor decided to shoot first. "Watch and learn," he muttered, half to Jules and half to the audience. He took in a breath, letting his AI-driven scope align the glowing reticle for a perfect shot. Crack! His first round was off in a supersonic blur. Downrange, the steel target pinged and the digital display showed a hit near dead center. A smattering of applause rose. Raynor allowed himself a tight grin. He hadn't expected any less. The system worked. Raynor fired again. Crack! Another hit almost atop the first. Through spotting scopes, observers marveled at the near-perfect grouping. High on confidence, Raynor didn't even wait for the drone's full wind update for his third shot. He steadied quickly and squeezed the trigger one more time. Bang! This time, a sudden gust swept the range. Even with advanced algorithms, physics had the final say. The third bullet nicked the edge of the target, a few inches off from the first 2. Raynor's jaw clenched. He hadn't expected a flyer. Still, his grouping was tight by any standard. Technology had given him an impressive edge. The crowd murmured appreciatively, and Raynor exhaled, shooting a sidelong glance at the old man next to him. It was Jules's turn. Jules drew a slow breath and shifted his body, nestling securely behind his wooden rifle. Where Raynor's station bristled with data streams and gadgetry, Jules's setup was almost bare bones. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pinch of sand, letting the grains trickle from his fingers. They drifted subtly to the west, confirming what his skin already felt: a light crosswind. Several spectators exchanged puzzled looks. Was he literally testing wind by touch? Jules adjusted the elevation on his simple scope with a quiet click-click, recalling countless shots over countless days in his past. Without fanfare, he eased the rifle's trigger. The report of the wooden rifle was hearty and unadorned. Boom! The first shot sped downrange. A half-second later, clang. The target was hit. Through binoculars, it looked slightly off-center, but a hit nonetheless. A few people gasped. Perhaps they hadn't expected the old gun to reach that far at all. Raynor scoffed under his breath, but Jules remained focused. He made a tiny correction on his scope and settled again. Another deep breath. Boom! Jules's second shot cracked out. This one felt good. A split second later, the observers erupted in surprise. The second impact punched the target mere inches from the first. The 2 bullet marks were almost touching. Raynor's confident expression faltered. He blinked, checking his own scope's digital readout to see if it was true. Before he could fully process it, Jules had already loaded his third round. The wind stilled. Jules' finger gently pressed the trigger one last time. Boom! The third shot thundered, the wooden rifle kicking into his shoulder. Everyone's eyes strained downrange. For an agonizing moment, nothing. Then clang! The spotters cried out. Unbelievably, the third bullet struck within a hair's breadth of the previous holes. 3 shots, one tight cluster on the steel. Jules slowly lifted his head from the rifle, exhaling, as a wave of astonished cheers and gasps broke out behind him. Raynor pushed up his goggles, scrambling to see the target with his naked eyes. His drone feed was already blinking with the results. The old man's grouping was tighter than his own. One of Rayner's technicians stared at a tablet in disbelief. Group size? 0.7 MOA? That's impossible, the young man muttered. The colonel let out a low whistle. Whispers rippled through the gathered crowd. This was beyond anyone's expectations. An army major strode forward, raising his voice so all could hear. Lieutenant Rayner's spread measured about 1.2 minutes of angle. Mr. Becker's. The major paused, shaking his head as a grin spread across his face. Roughly 0.6 minutes of angle. Half the size. A burst of incredulous chatter followed. They all knew what that meant. Against all odds, the old school had outshot the cutting edge. Lieutenant Rayner stood up slowly from his rifle, face flushed with shock. He had poured years into that smart scope project, and an unheard-of retiree just bested it with a wooden stick. Jules rose to his knees, respectfully clearing the chamber of his rifle. There was no gloating in his manner, just calm humility, as if this were another day at the range. The young cadet who had been watching pumped his fist in silent excitement, eyes shining with admiration for his newfound hero. Around them, the spectators broke into applause, some even cheering the astonishing upset. Rayner's colleagues looked at each other, part awe and part discomfort. Perhaps they realized they'd laughed too soon. In the space of a few minutes, everything had changed. High-tech pride had been humbled by raw skill and experience. Rayner swallowed hard, trying to process the reality that data alone hadn't guaranteed victory. And Jules? He simply gave a polite nod to Rayner across the way, as if to say, "Good shootin'." It was a gesture of sportsmanship and a subtle reminder that this was never about bragging rights for him. The crowd's clapping swelled, and even the colonel looked deeply satisfied. Jules Becker had done what no one expected. He proved that sometimes flesh and blood expertise can outdo even the smartest of gadgets. If your heart is racing at this triumphant turn and you love seeing arrogance humbled by true skill, make sure to subscribe for more stories like this. As the applause settled, Colonel Marshall, the grizzled officer who had set up the challenge, stepped forward with a broad smile. "Outstanding shooting, Mr. Becker," he said, offering a hand to Jules. Jules got to his feet fully and shook the colonel's hand firmly. "Thank you, sir," he replied in his quiet way. Rayner was still standing off to the side, grappling with equal parts amazement and embarrassment. The colonel's eyes twinkled as he looked between the two shooters. "I'll be honest, I didn't think I'd ever see shooting like that again," he said. "Not since Camp Pendleton back in '83. At that, Rayner's head snapped up. Pendleton, 1983, the engraving on Jules' rifle. Rayner stepped closer, his voice lowered with new respect. "The first shot drill. I've heard about it in sniper school. The legend of a perfect cold-bore shot in a storm," he said slowly, piecing it together. He looked at Jules in awe. "That was you?" Jules gave a modest shrug, eyes drifting to the horizon as if the memory were written out there. "One lucky day for me," he murmured. The colonel chuckled, clapping Jules on the back. "Luck nothing. I was there, son," he said to Rayner. "It was skill, pure and simple. This man was teaching us things our manuals hadn't even caught up to yet." A stir rippled through the remaining listeners. They had witnessed not just a surprise contest, but the re-emergence of a legend. Lieutenant Rayner drew a deep breath and walked directly up to Jules. The younger man's cheeks were still a bit flushed, but now for a different reason. He extended his hand, the same one that had pulled a trigger guided by lasers and algorithms, and Jules accepted it without hesitation. "Sir," Rayner said sincerely, "I owe you an apology. I was disrespectful earlier, and I was wrong." Jules shook the lieutenant's hand firmly, his grip steady as oak. "Takes a good man to admit it," he said kindly. "And your shooting was excellent. That system of yours, it has real potential." Raynor managed a small, humbled smile. Complimented by the very man who beat him, he could only shake his head in wonder. "I can't lie, I've never seen anyone do what you just did. Not without everything." He gestured to the array of gadgets that now felt superfluous. Jules glanced at the high-tech rifle and drones, then back at Raynor. "All those tools are fine, Lieutenant. Incredible, really," he said. His voice carried no judgment, only truth. "But technology can only take you so far. In the end, it's the steadiness of your hand and the patience in your heart that make the shot. Never forget that." Raynor nodded, absorbing the hard-earned lesson. Nearby, the young cadet hopped the rope and rushed up, unable to contain his excitement any longer. "Mr. Becker, that was the coolest thing I've ever seen," he blurted out. A gentle laugh rose from the crowd at the boy's genuine enthusiasm. Jules' weathered face softened into a broad smile. He reached out and mussed the teenager's hair lightly. "Keep practicing, kid," he said warmly. "High-tech or old school, a good shooter is always learning." The cadet straightened up and gave Jules a snappy little salute, clearly inspired. Jules returned it playfully, earning a few chuckles from those around. Colonel Marshall stepped forward and addressed the crowd. "Let this be a lesson to us all," he declared. "High-tech gadgets are impressive, but nothing can replace a skilled and experienced hand." Heads nodded in agreement as murmurs of assent spread. Jules gently took back his wooden rifle and held it against his chest. The smooth wood was warm from the day's use. It had served him well through countless trials, and today it had helped teach a lesson no piece of technology could. As people began to disperse, Raynor lingered nearby, clearly reluctant to let the moment end. Gathering his nerve, he approached Jules again. "Mr. Becker, would you consider maybe advising our program someday?" he asked, earnest and a bit shy now. "Your expertise could help us make our system even better." It was a genuine offer of respect. Jules chuckled, resting a hand on the younger man's shoulder. "If you ever need an old sniper's perspective, son, you know where to find me," he replied warmly. Raynor broke into a grateful grin. In that moment, the gap between old school and new tech felt a little smaller. Jules then hoisted his rifle case and turned to go, but not before shaking the colonel's hand once more and clapping Raynor on the shoulder in a friendly gesture. The young cadet trotted beside him for a few steps, peppering him with questions about this technique or that mission. Jules answered one or two with a twinkle in his eye, then laughed. All right. One day you'll have your own stories to tell. Keep at it." With that, the cadet waved and let the old sniper depart. Walking toward the parking area, Jules paused to take one last look back. On the range, Raynor was demonstrating his drone to the colonel, but with a new humility in his stance. Others were still huddled in excited conversation about what they'd just seen. Jules allowed himself a quiet smile. Today, he hadn't just won a contest. He'd rekindled a respect for the fundamentals he loved. Sometimes, the most advanced tool is a master who needs none. On this day, an old sniper with a wooden rifle reminded everyone of that truth. And as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, Jules Becker, a master of his craft with or without technology, climbed into his truck and drove off, leaving a lasting legend in his wake.